Hey guys, Michael Merula here. You always hear about Godfrey's rebellion, but I realized that you haven't seen Baron Godfrey. And in this unusual episode of World Building, you will see a new version of his portrait that I first drew in 2021 when I started working on Godfrey's Rebellion and other stories from Unknown War, which is my world building project designed as art book. If you watch my episodes of World Building My World, you will already know a lot of information. This will be summary of how I started since beginning, what was my inspiration and much more. But do you know what's funny? When I used to do historical illustrations, people complain about historical accuracy, which is fine. I'm also a history nerd. I enjoy history before I learn to read. First I look at the pictures of prehistoric animals. When the movie Jurassic Park came out, I became obsessed with dinosaurs. Then I started watching Sword and Sandals movie from 80s. All these battles with mythological monsters, heroic adventures, Greek heroes and gods. All that probably shaped me into a person who does what I do today. In elementary school I learned about real ancient history. Oh boy, all these mystery civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Assyria, Greece, Persia, the Celts, the Romans. That was my first encounter with real history. At the turn of century, some of the best historical films were released. Braveheart, Gladiator, Troy, Kingdom of Heaven, and many others. Of course, The Lord of the Rings came out too, and it was true epic fantasy. I saw the third part in the cinema. The Battle of Minas Tirith is still one of the most epic experiences I have seen. I remember a friend running out of the cinema because he was scared of the orcs. We were young. But I was already hardened by watching my favorite sci-fi movie, Alien. At the time, I played a lot of games, Age of Empires and Mythology, Heroes of Might and Magic, Rome Total War, Prince of Persia, and many others, which combine everything I loved. During that time, I read a lot of historical novels, but I felt that need to know more. In high school, I started reading books by Asian authors. One of the first was Polybius and his description of Punic Wars, which is still my favorite historical period just because of the many different nations involved in this war. If you know my Aquila conquest story, you can find some common theme with Punic Wars in the terms of different civilizations. Of course, at school I learned about the history of art and I sought out artists and different styles myself. That's when I finally discovered Angus McBride and his gouache illustrations that I had seen in the books since I was a child. I also read a lot of comics, and that was my first encounter with Conan and The Frost Giant's Daughter by Gary North, and of course the masterful paintings of Frank Frazetta, and that was the turning point. Dark and wild yet believable world of heroic fantasy. When I looked for more, I found there was a movie, Conan the Barbarian, with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and music by Basil Poledouris. Can you imagine that frenzy I was in? It was epic. At school I had a great friend who loved fantasy, movies, art. He introduced me to Dungeons and Dragons, and he even looked like Conan, just in the smaller version. So we didn't talk about anything else for the next 4 years. I was also obsessed with Atlantis back then, and still bit I am. I wish so much for it to be real, and actually that was when my first fantasy story, Velovesus, began to take a shape in my head. A story that would combine history and my fantasy about this lost island in the form of heroic adventure. Back then I even drew 30 comic pages because I wanted to make this story into dark comic in the style of Frank Frazetta or Frank Miller and his 300. I had written the entire script and done a lot of work. Unfortunately, I lost all my work during amateur PC formatting. And so this story remained only in my memories for the next 10 years. Maybe you remember how I talk about the creation of Godfrey's Rebellion, one of my other fantasy stories. Back then I was lying in the hospital and couldn't walk, incurable disease that changed my life. So to escape the painful reality, I turned back to my fantasy. Of course, during that time I continued to draw and expand my knowledge of history. I practiced HEMA, historical fencing, and reenacting Napoleonic Wars as French Young Guard so I gained some practical experience when I fought at the Austerlitz, Waterloo and other battles. And now I get to original question what was in quotes so funny when I had such experience, and in my next dark period of life which almost killed me because I was at the bottom and I had no reason to live, I painted black and red images of historical battles and warriors. Comments began to appear pointing out the historical inaccuracies of my illustrations. And they were comments like, oh, you know, this helmet was used a year later, this button is the wrong shape, why is he holding spear like that? These were valid comments. I never aimed for complete historical accuracy, and I know that many of my paintings are more my fantasy than archaeological reconstructions. And I am not trying to defend myself in any way, but basically I said, you know what? I will make my own historical illustration according to my own fantasy and style. And so my pseudo-historical fantasy work, Unknown World of Ida, was born, which I had in my head for several years in the form of stories like Velovesus, Prince Tolan and Godfrey's Rebellion. And this began to take shape as my illustrated book about a work that tells its fantasy history and that keep me continue in life, because I told myself I cannot die until I finish and share this project, so I start my YouTube channel to document my work if something happened to me. During the development and sharing of my work, I have come in contact with wonderful people who I now call my friends. And I have very small community of people by the standards of social medias and YouTube, but I love every one of you because you are amazing people who always bring joy, positivity, support and good vibes. And do you know what happened? I started doing my illustration in bright and vibrant colors in the style of painter Angus McBride, who is definitely my favorite historical illustrator. People suddenly started writing me how they enjoy my work, how I inspire them, and they support me in the best way. Two of my now good friends joined my Patreon, and that helped me to overcome and endure hard times. And I wanted my work to be positive, even though my thoughts were dark. Also, I got comments how my warriors look historically accurate, and it's actually because I combine and mix history into my fantasy. That's why many of my character designs and illustrations of warriors look real, because they are a reflection of real history. As I mentioned, I don't like completely fictional fantasy and names that can't be pronounced, so I use real names, the names of civilization and cultures, which I take from the books of Asian authors and use Asian names. Many people also think I am ripping off Hyborian age. It's true that Conan is my passion and shaped me a lot of during my teens, and I certainly unconsciously get inspired by him. But the reality is that my work has nothing to do with Conan. Expect that, like Robert E. Howard, I was inspired by the same theory about the origin of human races and civilizations, but I talk about that in another video. Originally I wanted to make video about how I went back to original illustrations and character designs that I started doing for the Godfrey's Rebellion 2 years ago, but I somehow got overwhelmed by nostalgia and wanted to retrospectively tell you about the creation of my work, because I love when artists talk about what inspired them in their work. I think that's the greatest charm of their art. And believe or not, many people think my paintings are not mine, or that I just copy others, which is again a bit funny because my art is not that good and nothing special. I'm just ordinary guy struggling with life who likes to tell stories, draw and live in my own fantasy. But aren't we all like that? Because this topic connects us all. That's why you are here, right? I would love to hear what you enjoy. How did you get into history? Are you also working on your fantasy worlds? What inspires you? Tell me everything that comes to your mind. You never know how one comment can change someone's life. Of course, I forgot about the 1,000 things I want to say. After all, the beginning of my work dates back to some 12 years ago. Anyway, thank you if you listened this far, and thank you for all your support. Special thanks to my Patreons, Gerard and Simon. And if you want to know more or just want to support my work and this channel, join my Patreon. And don't forget to give thumbs up so I know you like these kind of videos. Love you all and see you next time.